Greetings and welcome to 10th Talk. In this episode, I talk with José Niño about gun control. Now, José is from Venezuela, and this gives him a really unique perspective on political issues. José has worked as a gun rights lobbyist, and he believes in a no-compromise right to keep and bear arms. He thinks the only way to fight the modern gun control agenda is through a decentralized state and local approach. All right. Well, welcome to 10th Talk. We are here today with José Niño, and very excited to have him on. We're going to talk a little bit about gun control here in a second. But before we get into the topic, José, why don't you just give us a little bit of your background and kind of tell us who you are and where you're coming from?
Sure thing, Mike. Well, thank you. First off, thank you for having me on. And, well, I was originally born in Venezuela and came to the States when I was relatively young, right before things like really started to crumble over there. And I got into politics basically through Ron Paul.
Okay.
Watched a lot of his videos. This is around like 2007. And I was pretty active in a lot of libertarian groups during my university years at the University of Texas at Austin. I headed up several groups there as well. And I've spent time abroad too, like in Chile, where I did some graduate studies and I worked for a free market think tank. But my real political work experience was when I came back to the States, like in 2016, where I worked for a no compromise gun lobby, National Association for Gun Rights, as a lobbyist for some period of time, and also as a copywriter, email marketer. So I got a lot of firsthand experience with grassroots politics. Now I'm a freelance writer, and I've authored 2 ebooks, The 10 Myths of Gun Control and How Socialism Destroyed Venezuela. And I write for various outlets like the Mises Institute, Big League Politics, Liberty Conservative News, and ammo.com.
Yeah, I can tell that you've got that email marketing background from, I'm on your email list, and you definitely have that, and you do a great job with it. We'll make sure people have a link and a way to get on that email list because it's worth being on. I like the no compromise gun control because our position at the 10th Amendment Center is that shall not infringe means exactly that. And at least at the federal level, we can have the debate about the incorporation doctrine, but certainly the federal government has absolutely no power to control guns in any way, shape, or form. And most states have the same provisions in their state constitution. So we would definitely agree on the no compromise. But of course, obviously, you're going to get the pushback. Well, you have to be for common sense gun control, right? And, we reject that. And obviously you do too. But let's talk a little bit about that idea, because I feel like in a lot of ways, it's a Trojan horse. When people talk about common sense gun control, they really mean banning certain kinds of guns and creating an environment where more gun control can be brought in. Is that kind of your take on it as well?
Yes, it's essentially, as you described it, Mike, a Trojan horse. And really, it is kind of a ruse for the larger end game of civilian disarmament, or the very least, a kind of 2-tier system where you have a very privileged elite like the rich or the politically connected and the law enforcement state, the bureaucratic state, as the only ones with the guns, and the other people where it will be like you and me will not be able to get the guns, or it will be prohibitively expensive to acquire these firearms. And yes, the common sense gun control is actually a pretty solid form of marketing. You've seen the gun control crowd change its marketing strategy over the past few decades. Now you hear like gun safety, common sense gun control, any type of like accessory bans. You'll also hear the typical appeals of like, I support the Second Amendment, but.
Yeah, I always say you can ignore anything after the but.
Yeah, Michael Malice says that, yes.
Yeah.
And a new one, as a gun owner, ... insert like next clause justifying gun control. Well, in reality now, what's pretty scary, I think, now in the gun control debate is that there's like a normalization of the fact that some people are calling for the repeal of the Second Amendment after the former Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens went out and put out that trial balloon. You're starting to see on very like fringe elements of the left, but it's starting to make some headway in a lot of like political conversations. And as much as I like to bash the left, I am of the opinion the right has been pretty useless on this issue as well.
Absolutely. They're awful.
And this is based on my experience in the no compromise lobby. And it's specifically true when we go on offensive battles, because when I worked with NAGR's unique value proposition was that it was like the lobby that was specifically pushing for constitutional carry.
Right.
In every state, ideally. But right now, the states that we mostly focus on tend to be red states that are more rural in nature. And when we go to states like red states that are much more urbanized, you get a different type of brand of Republican and also stronger interest groups like law enforcement agencies that will present huge obstacles. In fact, I'd say that they're the first obstacles you have to worry about. Forget the left. We know that the left is against us on that issue. It's the enemy from within, if you will, that is going to be the biggest hindrance towards progressing. And like you even saw with Florida, for example, in 2018, a Republican governor with a Republican gun controlled legislature, Rick Scott, governor of Florida, signed a whole slew of gun control, from red flag gun confiscation orders to bump stock bans. And this was done under what is supposedly one of the more conservative legislatures in the country. And since then, this is in the context of the Parkland massacre.
Right.
Since then, the left has become really emboldened. Now every blue state has passed some form of gun control since that shooting. And it's a matter of time before some of the more softer red states start following suit. For example, the state I'm in right now, Colorado, used to be one of the most pro-gun states prior to the Aurora theater shooting, and in fact led the way on some policies such as campus carry. Since then, it's completely gone downhill on the issue. And so you see here that the traditional political model of thinking that just because the politician has an R beside his name, he's automatically pro-gun is not necessarily the case. At best, they may provide a defense against certain really wacky gun control schemes, but more often than not, they're pretty useless when we're going on offense, because that's what really matters. We need to get points on the board.
Yeah.
We need to actually pass good legislation at the state level. We need to bring back more local control in our increasingly centralized political system. So I think it's gotten pretty unstable, and also several things too, I think, that have changed a lot that even a lot of solid grassroots activists have not been aware of. You're seeing corporate gun control now as well. For example, banks now are starting to break ties with pro-gun organizations. A lot of corporations are starting to break ties as well with their pro-gun affiliates or any type of gun organization whatsoever. In my writings with Big League Politics, I recently reported on how Kroger will no longer have like guns and ammo magazines on their shelves. And it's part of a stronger cultural push which ultimately will translate into a anti-gun political outcome. So the battles we're facing now are very unconventional in nature. What we were taught about lobbying and politics in the past really does not apply anymore, because we're dealing with an enemy that not only has control of legislatures and the typical academic settings, they're taking over civil society and the corporate boardroom as well. And that's why I think like what you guys do is great, because we do have to get much more engaged in our communities. That's where we have like the most direct impact. That's where the average person can make a difference. You don't have to worry that much about the insane barriers to entry of entering in federal politics. Right. That's one thing that I have changed my opinion in the decade I've been involved in politics in some shape or form. I have largely kind of checked out of federal politics.
Yeah, I had that same journey, and it's hard to break your mindset from that, because that's what we're taught, from the time we take civics in elementary school or middle school. We're taught that Washington D.C. is the mecca and everything is federal, and it took me a long time. I remember early on when I started working with TAC, Michael Bolden said to me, "Never call the 202 area code." And for people to know that that's Washington D.C.'s area code, and I thought, well, why would you not call the 202 area code? I totally am on board with that now, and we've seen a lot more success, not just on guns, but on a wide range of issues, working through the state and local action. And I think I say this all the time. I wish that the gun people would take a page out of the playbook of the marijuana people. Whether or not you're an advocate of marijuana legalization or not, those folks did it the right way. They started in one state. They started locally. They were tenacious. They were willing to face the consequences when the crackdowns came, and they were willing to ride it out. And, today we have 33 states with medical marijuana. We've got, I think, 11 now that have legalized completely. So, the gun people, their strategy tends to be, well, we're going to get a court case, and we're going to get some good judges, and they're going to overturn. No, it's not going to happen. So let me ask you this, because here's the difficulty just when you start talking about messaging, because it sounds reasonable if I say to you, Jose, we have all these mass shootings, and, surely you believe that we need to do something in order to protect the children. So how do you respond to that? How do we retake the narrative?
Well, I think that protection is something that can be done via civil society. It's not something exclusive to the state.
No, you have to have the state.
You don't have to go towards a top-down solution. We're not against protection. We just believe that these gun-free zones that enable these shootings don't allow for law-abiding individuals, whether it be staff or other people, to protect students from madmen in these situations, or B, have like these schools become more autonomous and actually provide security services themselves. I'm not one of those people that says that everybody on this campus needs to be armed. It's all about the freedom for the individuals there, or at least the people running the school, the people with the skin in the game, to determine what policies they can implement to secure their schools. I'm not into universalistic principles. Certain schools will pursue different policies because there are trade-offs and opportunity costs to arming people. And sometimes our tendency is to outsource to private security and other type of institutions. But yeah, I think it comes down to this, that the status response is that if we don't do something, said service, protection in this case, will not be provided, which I believe is fallacious.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we're on the same page there for sure. Now, you, from your home country, you've seen firsthand what can happen when a populace is disarmed. And it's funny because people want to talk about gun control, and we even see this a lot on the right. And, this is kind of NRA messaging, hunting. We're hunters and we have a right to hunt. And let's get down to the brass tacks. The reason that the Second Amendment was ratified was to ensure that the population would remain armed as a deterrent to government tyranny. That's the bottom line. That's what it was for. And in the United States, people have a hard time wrapping their heads around that because I think most people don't believe that A, they don't believe that the government will ever get that tyrannical. And B, I think somehow they think that, well, there's no way that we could fight off the government in the first place. But you've seen in Venezuela kind of, I wouldn't say necessarily firsthand, but I'm sure that you still have very tight connections there, what that looks like. Can you kind of talk about that a little bit and explain what happened in that country?
Well, we have to go back to basically first principles. I'm a historian, so I like to look at things from a more macro historical perspective. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the U.S.'s Second Amendment wasn't something that just happened out of thin air. Right. It's part of like a multi-century process that originated with England. Mm-hmm. If you think about it, it's an Anglo-Saxon tradition, right, specifically from the Levelers, who were actually pretty libertarian and wanted to reform English governance along more decentralized lines. Mm-hmm. And that paved the way for like the development of a more decentralized militia in England. And that tradition was transplanted to the 13 colonies in the U.S. Now, in stark contrast with the Spanish tradition, the Spaniards, it's weird because they did have some degrees of federalism, but they never really believed in a right to bear arms or had much of a culture of people that owned firearms in non-military functions. It was only the colonial elites and many politically connected people that had firearms. Civilian firearm ownership was very rare. And that tradition has persisted even to the present. For example, Venezuela's first comprehensive gun control regulations were implemented in the 1930s, which effectively banned civilian firearm ownership with the exception of like 22 rifles and other like hunting equipment. And the only way you could acquire firearms were if you were part of like the police, military, or some type of private security detail. That's generally a loophole that in a lot of Latin American countries people use, especially the rich use, to get firearms through private security. But in the Venezuelan case, when Hugo Chavez came into power, he passed a law right after the failed coup attempt of his government in 2002, the civilian disarmament law that kind of laid the foundation for more gun control there. And essentially people had to go through the military to get their firearms. They doubled down in 2012 and expanded that and actually did a lot of gun buybacks. And Nicolas Maduro, the current leader, has expanded the program. They do give guns out to supporters of the regime, but this goes back to like a more salient point. Gun bans are not wholesale bans. They're only banning civilians and people that could possibly rise up in opposition, because the government, they're keeping their guns. Right. The bureaucrats, they're keeping their guns. All the enforcement arms of the state and the people politically connected to them, whether they're in the private or public sector, they're going to keep their guns. Heck, they might even receive more firearms for their blind loyalty to the state. But in the Venezuelan case, you also have the fact that there's just a huge breakdown of social order because of its multi-decades of socialist policies, which I've written extensively, not just in my book, but also for Mises articles. So you've seen the development of like kind of a criminal underworld rise up and become a huge actor there that preys upon the populace. And they have pretty much free reign to do whatever they want because most of the populace is disarmed, and those that do arm themselves, they're doing it illegally. They're clearly violating laws, and oftentimes it makes sense for them to violate the law because there is a complete breakdown of social order. Like even the basic municipal services, like law enforcement, cannot like protect them at all times. And this goes across the board in first world and third world contexts. Even in the first world, police response times are simply just not adequate enough to meet like the criminal threats. But in the Venezuelan case, you're going beyond criminal threats. You're talking about like gun ownership is what possibly will bring about much more of a stable political fabric when you have multiple elements that are trying to persecute you, whether it be criminals or the government, which is often a criminal institution in more cases than not.
I remember one of the endearing images of the LA riots, gosh, back in the 90s, were the Korean shopkeepers on their rooftops with their rifles protecting their stores and their property. And, that kind of goes to your point, even in the United States, where we tend to think, oh, the police are going to protect us. That's not necessarily true in all times and all places. Anybody who's ever been in a serious storm where you have a breakdown of the electrical grid, you know what that's like. The system breaks down very, very quickly. And so you're absolutely right in the sense that, ultimately we have to be responsible for our own safety and security. I don't want to farm that out to somebody else. And I always, I tell people all the time, they'll say, well, Mike, the police will protect you. I'm like, what the police are going to do? If somebody breaks into my house that's armed, that has the intent of hurting me or my family, what the police would be able to do is come, put the tape on the floor. Of course, in my case, I'm armed, so they're going to put the tape on the floor around the guy who got into my house. But it's kind of a responsibility thing in my mind. It's my responsibility to protect my property, my life, in the life of my family, and to try to farm that out to somebody else is absurd. Another point that I really resonates with me that you made is the fact that when we talk about gun control, we're not really talking about gun control. We're talking about monopolizing guns in the hands of certain individuals or institutions or groups. And, I talk a lot on my various platforms about the fact that, people that say, well, we want gun control to stop the violence. Well, it requires violence to have gun control. I mean, it is inherently violent to take guns away from people, especially people who don't want their guns taken away from. So this notion that they're, peaceful and that they stand on this moral high ground, it rakes on my nerves, to be honest with you, when I hear that kind of thing. What do you think, the other argument that you get, and I think this is pretty easy to debunk, but I'll throw it at you and see how you address it. Well, Mike, you're not going to protect yourself from the government because the government has tanks and F-16s and missiles. Well, you're not going to do anything with your AR-15, you idiot. How do you answer that?
Well, I'll go more radical and just say that just makes the case for like the legalization of like more military grade weapons. We're not just talking about, that's why like you can't argue the Second Amendment on defense grounds. But here's one thing too. I mean, you look at like some of the cases of asymmetric warfare that the U.S. has found itself mired in.
Right.
It's lost wars against countries that have possessed like a significant deficit in terms of military technology. You've had like peasants with just mere rifles fight off people, and if they're able to coordinate correctly, and it might not guarantee you victory, but it gives you a fighting chance. I could tell you right now, if you're disarmed, there's no way you're going to win. Like
right. You'd
have to pull off your best Conan the Barbarian impression to like do that, and that's not going to stop bullets, man. So, yeah, like the whole point of being armed is it gives you a fighting chance. There's no guarantees out here, but sure. I'd rather have that option than be deprived of it and desperately needed in some type of situation like that.
Yeah. I'm an 80s kid, so I vividly remember the movie Red Dawn, which I think they did a remake, but I never watched the remake because I'm sure it would disappoint me. But yeah, people that may not be familiar with the movie, the premise was that the Soviets invade the United States, and there's Russian and Cuban forces, and this group of teenagers in Colorado, escapes into the mountains with a few rifles, and eventually creates this resistance movement. And it's a movie. Obviously, it's fictionalized, but it is pretty realistic in the scenario, because if you have a few weapons, then you have the capability of procuring more weapons. And and I'll say this for my my pacifist friends, even if you don't want to engage in violent revolution, and I'm honestly not a big fan of violent revolution, because I tend to think that violent revolutions end up producing another violent government in the long run. But the fact of the matter is, even somebody like Gandhi, he used nonviolent resistance, but he always said that it was important to have the means, because there had to be the doubt in their mind that you can defend yourself, that you do have that power. You need to practice nonviolence out of a position of power. And that's what happens when you have an armed society. When you don't, it's really easy to round up the people that you want to round up. And, again, just the situation in Venezuela, and we've seen it in other countries. We've seen it even in the United States in certain situations. There is no guarantee that everything's going to be fine and dandy forever. It's foolish to believe that your government is always going to be benevolent and kind. I think you would agree. I want to touch on one other thing that's not guns, but it touches on the other book that you've written. And just real quick, debunk this silly idea that what we had in Venezuela is not real socialism.
Well, my book, what I take pride in is that I have like a very contrarian perspective, in that not only do I refute what a lot of the left says, but I also refute a lot what the right says too on Venezuela. Because when we look at Venezuela, it's had pretty large state control of economic affairs for the past 50 years prior to Chavez. And we've seen it from the nationalization of the oil industry, which actually happened in the 1970s, to the government's takeover of its supposedly independent central bank. These trends, along with a lot of crony capitalistic policies, price controls, currency controls, made the average Venezuelan in 1998 poorer on a per capita GDP basis than the average Venezuelan in 1958. This led to the rise of Hugo Chavez, because he basically campaigned on saying like this: from 1958 to 1998, the Venezuelan government was democratic, but he basically said this bipartisan democratic system was a complete failure. So he campaigned on that, and he pointed out that we are poor as a country. We were supposed to be first world, blah, blah, blah. Ironically, he continued the same policies and doubled down. But what we see here is it's an economic policy death spiral, where the political elites, including cultural and educational elites, did not recognize what the root problem was, state intervention. And instead they try to double down or try to fix things, if you will, through more government involvement. And over time, that will completely destroy an economy and a society. And just to highlight how bad structurally things are in Venezuela, the last time Venezuela had single-digit inflation was in 1983. So Venezuelan millennials have never seen single-digit inflation in their lifetimes. And for example, one of the moves that precipitated my dad's decision to pack things up and leave Venezuela, take my family as well, was like in the mid 1990s, inflation was at 100%, and his small business was like crushed by that. Most people in the West don't understand what even like double digit inflation, let alone triple or quadruple digit inflation looks like. And that stuff completely destroys a middle class like overnight.
Yep. I think we're on our way to double-digit inflation in the, I won't say the near future, but down the road. I don't think that the Federal Reserve policy that it's adopted is sustainable in the long term without ultimately having price inflation. They've managed to keep the inflation in the stock markets and in assets by creating asset bubbles so far. But I think Americans are going to have to wake up to the reality of inflation. And I like what you say about the intervention. We have way too much of it here in the United States as well. And it's the old joke that the government breaks your leg and then hands you a crutch. It creates a problem and then claims to fix it and ultimately creates more problems.
Yeah. It's really a disease-infected Band-Aid when you think about it. Like
that's gross.
and that's how it like metastasizes. I mean, with the U.S.'s case, the entitlements and just demographics in general will probably do it in. And once like there's like a massive fiscal reversal, the U.S. is going to be faced with some tough decisions. It with either A, direct tax increases, which are always politically unpopular, right, or B, the stealth tax to rule them all. Flat out loose money, which causes inflation.
Yeah.
That's what happened with Venezuela to some extent, because after it nationalized its oil in the 1970s, it engaged in really massive spending binges. And racked up so much debt that it was forced to devalue its currency in 1983. That's why 1983 was the last year that Venezuela saw a single-digit inflation. Since then, and it had to juggle between that or introducing a value-added tax, which was very unpopular in the 1990s. And it was like one reason among many that caused people like my father and other small business owners to like shut down their operations. And when you engage in massive spending, someone's going to have to foot the bill. Might not be the people in the present, but definitely in the future. And that's going to be either paid through taxation or through inflation, which is another form of taxation, which is arguably worse because at least with increased taxes, you can tie that to specifically a politician that votes for it. You can theoretically vote him out, lobby him out, put pressure on them. But with inflation, you're talking about unelected Federal Reserve board members or whatever central bank is in power. And there's not much accountability in that space.
Yeah, not at all. And then the other problem is that when people see inflation, they don't understand it. So, the political parties will politicize it and, finger point at each other and exacerbate the problem with whatever solution that they're going to come up with, whatever government intervention or, spending plan or whatever garbage that they come up with that will make things worse. And so that kind of brings us back around to the overriding theme, whether when it comes to guns or economics, is we need much more decentralization, much less centralization, and I think you made an excellent point in that the key to fighting this is to fight on the state and even in the local level, particularly with guns. And we're seeing this. We're beginning to see counties and cities.
Yes, the sanctuary stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll put some links in the on the notes in the page that give some practical steps. We also want to put in your various links so people can reach out to you and people can get these books. So why don't you give us all your contact stuff?
Sure. 1 second. All right. Let's go here. Yeah, you can reach me at my newsletter, josealnino.com/newsletter. And if you want like my books, josealnino.com/how-socialism-destroyed-Venezuela for my Venezuela book. And then for my gun book, you can just go to josealnino.com 10-myths-gun-control for my gun control book. And I'm also on Twitter at Jose Al Nino, that I post most of my stuff there. And I'm also on Facebook as well at Jose Niño. You can friend me. I also have a Facebook page that's also called Jose Al Nino. Those are the best places to reach me at.
And we'll put all those on the show notes page, and definitely get on Jose's email list. He sends out good ones. It's always fun as a journalist, it's always fun to read good writers. So I certainly enjoy that. But you're definitely going to get the content. If this has stirred your interest, you definitely want to get in on his list. Well, I appreciate you taking a little bit of time out of your day and chatting on this subject. And hopefully people will check out your books. And you've written some articles for the 10th Amendment Center, and hopefully we'll get you up on there more in the future.
Thank you so much, Mike. It was a pleasure talking.
All right. You have a good one. Well, that wraps up this episode of Tinther Talk. Thank you so much for taking a little bit of time out of your day to listen to the show. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and consider leaving a comment with your thoughts on what Jose had to say. I thought one of the most interesting things he talked about was the origins of the right to self-defense in English tradition compared to Spanish, and the evolution of gun control in his home country. Thanks again for joining me, and I'll see you again in the next episode.